The scent of $1 million worth of white orchids was supposed to be the fragrance of Dante Marchetti's ultimate triumph. Instead, it became the stench of his greatest humiliation. 2 weeks ago, inside the grandiose vaulted ceilings of St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Boston, the undisputed head of the Marchetti Syndicate had stood at the altar in a custom Armani tuxedo, waiting for an Omega who would never walk down the aisle. His Omega, Julian Ashford, the quiet, unassuming son of a mid-level logistics manager in his organization, had vanished. He had left behind a meticulously tailored Vera Wang wedding suit, hanging like a ghost in the bridal suite. A 3-carat flawless diamond engagement ring resting on the vanity. And a reputation-shattering scandal that rippled through the darkest underbellies of the city. In Dante's world, a world dictated by blood oaths, territorial control, and violent retribution, respect was the only currency that mattered. Julian's disappearance was not merely a broken heart. It was a declaration of war against his pride. Whispers had immediately ignited among the Capos and rival families. The great Dante Marchetti couldn't even control a fragile Omega from the suburbs. The humiliation burned hotter than a gunshot wound. For 14 agonizing days, Dante did not sleep. He transformed from a calculating businessman into a relentless, obsessed bloodhound. He refused to let his enforcers handle the hunt. This was personal. He tore through Julian's father's house, interrogated his closest confidants, and utilized a sprawling network of underground surveillance to track a ghost. Julian had been clever. He had abandoned all electronics, paid for everything in cash, and used a series of burner identities to weave his way across state lines. But no one, not even a desperate Omega, could outrun the reach of the Marchetti family forever. A slip-up at a tiny off-the-grid pharmacy in the snow-draped mountains of Crested Butte, Colorado, was all it took. He had purchased suppressants under the name Clara Davis, but the face captured on the grainy security footage was unmistakably his. Now, the unforgiving Colorado wind howled through the narrow, desolate alleys of the mountain town. The temperature had plummeted below zero, and a fresh blizzard was rapidly burying the streets in heavy, blinding powder. Dante stepped out of his black SUV, his long wool overcoat whipping around his calves. The crunch of his leather boots against the frozen pavement sounded like breaking bones. He gripped the handle of the custom 1911 pistol holstered beneath his jacket, though he knew he wouldn't need it. He spotted him a block away, exiting a dimly lit diner with a paper bag clutched to his chest. Julian was bundled in a cheap, oversized olive green parka, his head down, fighting the gale. Even buried under layers of thrift store clothing, Dante recognized the delicate slope of his shoulders and the panicked, hurried rhythm of his steps. "Julian," he whispered to the wind, a dark, lethal satisfaction pooling in his chest. He moved like a shadow, cutting through a parallel alleyway to intercept his path. As Julian rounded the corner of a boarded-up sporting goods store, Dante stepped out from the darkness, blocking his only avenue of escape. Julian halted so violently, he nearly slipped on the ice. The paper bag slipped from his numb fingers, spilling a lukewarm coffee and a wrapped sandwich onto the snow. For a suspended second, neither of them moved. The street lights flickered overhead, casting long, menacing shadows across the snowdrifts. Dante stepped forward, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered violently in his cheek. He had played out this moment 1,000 times in his head. He had planned to drag him back to Boston by his hair, to parade him in front of the family he had disgraced, to lock him away in his Lake Forest estate until he learned the true cost of making a fool out of Dante Marchetti. "Did you really think?" Dante's voice was a low, guttural snarl that cut through the howling wind. "That you could just walk away from me? From the family? From the oath you took?" Julian took a trembling step backward, his back hitting the freezing brick wall of the alley. his breath plumed in the freezing air in rapid, terrified gasps. He looked up at Dante, his wide, hollow eyes devoid of the vibrant warmth he remembered. He looked starved, haunted. "Dante, please," Julian rasped, his voice cracking, completely devoid of defense. "You don't understand. You have to stay away from me. Stay away from you." Dante closed the distance in two massive strides, his imposing frame trapping Julian against the bricks. He slammed his gloved hands against the wall on either side of his head. "You belong to me, Julian. You made a mockery of my name. You humiliated me in front of the entire commission. I had to." Julian cried out, turning his face away from him, squeezing his eyes shut as if expecting a physical blow. "If I stayed, if I married you." "Lies," Dante roared, his legendary temper snapping the last threads of his restraint. Blinded by a toxic mixture of betrayal and raw adrenaline, he reached out and grabbed the collar of Julian's heavy parka to haul him away from the wall. He pulled too hard. The cheap fabric of his coat gave way with a loud rip. The force of his pull tore the zipper down, and as Julian twisted violently to escape his grasp, his oversized wool sweater snagged on the jagged edge of a broken brick protruding from the wall. The heavy knit fabric ripped sharply, exposing his left shoulder and the upper curve of his back to the freezing night air. Dante opened his mouth to deliver a vicious threat, but the words died instantly in his throat. All the air evaporated from his lungs. The furious, burning rage that had sustained him for 2 weeks vanished, replaced by an icy, paralyzing horror. There, marring the pale, flawless skin he had once sworn to cherish, was a massive, grotesque scar. The brand was monstrous. It wasn't the clean accidental slice of a surgical knife or the random jagged tear of an accident. It was deliberate, calculated. The flesh on Julian's shoulder blade was violently puckered, raised and discolored into a furious, angry red. The burn marks were fresh, perhaps no more than a few weeks old, the exact timeline of his disappearance. But it was the shape of the mutilation that made Dante's blood run colder than the Colorado blizzard. It was a crest, a serpent tightly coiled around a bleeding dagger, the undisputed emblem of the Valentino crime syndicate. Dante froze, his gloved hands hovering uselessly in the air. The Valentinos were his most vicious rivals, a bloodthirsty faction operating out of New York who had been trying to dethrone the Marchettis for a decade. Enzo Valentino, their sadistic underboss, was infamous for his medieval methods of psychological warfare. "Julian," Dante whispered, his voice stripped of all its menacing authority. The mob boss who controlled governors and police chiefs was suddenly reduced to a horrified, trembling alpha. "Who did this to you?" Julian whimpered, desperately trying to pull the torn edges of his sweater and coat back together. He was shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering from a combination of the sub-zero temperature and sheer, unadulterated terror. "Don't look at it," he sobbed, pressing his back flush against the frozen brick to hide the mark. "Please, Dante. Don't look at it." Dante, the childhood nickname he had used in their most private moments, pierced straight through the armor Dante had built around his heart. He didn't ask again. He didn't demand explanations in the snow. Moving with sudden, terrifying gentleness, Dante unbuttoned his heavy cashmere-lined overcoat and slipped it off his shoulders. He wrapped it securely around Julian's trembling frame, cocooning him in his warmth and scent, the rich, smoky scent of expensive cologne and something darker, more primal. Without a word, he scooped Julian up into his arms, ignoring his weak protests, and carried him through the blizzard back to his idling SUV. Once inside the heavily armored vehicle, with the heat blasting and the tinted windows isolating them from the world, Dante locked the doors. He poured a measure of bourbon from a crystal decanter in the console and pressed the glass to Julian's frozen lips. He drank, coughing violently as the alcohol burned its way down his throat. Dante gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white. He stared straight ahead at the swirling snow illuminated by the headlights. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, and heavy with the weight of unspoken atrocities. The night of the rehearsal dinner, Julian finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the SUV's heater. Dante closed his eyes. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He had left him alone at the estate with his security detail. He had thought his Omega was completely safe. I went to the gardens to get some air, Julian continued, a tear slipping down his pale cheek, catching the dim interior lights. Your men, they were already dead, Dante. Before I could even scream, someone grabbed me. They dragged me into the maintenance shed. Dante's chest heaved. He remembered finding the 2 guards dead the next morning, but the scene had been scrubbed clean. His lieutenants had convinced him it was a random hit, unrelated to Julian's sudden disappearance the following day. He had been so blinded by the fact that Julian had packed a bag and left a note saying he didn't love him that he hadn't seen the truth right in front of his eyes. It was Enzo, Julian choked out, wrapping his arms tightly around himself beneath Dante's coat. Enzo Valentino. He brought a blowtorch and an iron brand. He tied me to a chair. A low, animalistic sound ripped from Dante's throat. It was a sound born of pure agony and lethal, unbounded violence. He told me, Julian cried, his composure completely shattering, that if I walked down that aisle, he would blow up St. Michael's Cathedral. He showed me the blueprints. He showed me pictures of the explosive charges they had already planted near the organ. He said he would let the doors lock and he would burn you, your mother, your little sister, and every capo in your family alive. Dante turned his head slowly to look at him. The full, crushing weight of his ignorance crashed down upon him. Julian hadn't run away from him. He hadn't betrayed him. He had sacrificed himself to save his entire bloodline. He burned me, Julian whispered, his eyes dark and hollow. He held the iron to my skin and told me I was marked. That if I ever tried to contact you, if I ever tried to warn you, he would send his men to butcher you in your sleep. And he made my father watch. Your father? My father sold the security codes to Enzo, Julian wept, burying his face in his hands. He traded my life and your family's lives to clear his gambling debts with the Valentinos. He told me what to write in that letter. He packed my bags. Enzo told me to run and never look back. The silence in the SUV returned, but this time it was electric. It was the silence before a catastrophic explosion. Dante Marchetti, the alpha who had spent the last 2 weeks plotting ways to destroy the Omega he loved, now understood that the true enemy was sitting right in his own boardroom. Julian's father, Enzo Valentino. They had defiled his Omega, tortured the Omega he loved, and manipulated him into a blind rage. Dante reached across the console. He didn't grab him roughly. He gently pried Julian's trembling hands away from his face, interlacing his large, warm fingers with his freezing ones. He brought his knuckles to his lips and pressed a slow, reverent kiss against his skin. Julian, Dante said softly, though his dark eyes were completely dead, swirling with a promise of apocalyptic retribution. They thought they could break you to break me, but they made a fatal mistake. What mistake? Julian whispered, staring into the face of the monster he loved. They left you alive. Dante pulled out his encrypted satellite phone and dialed a number he reserved only for total war. And now, Enzo Valentino is going to learn exactly why they call me the Devil of Boston. The sleek silver fuselage of Dante's private Gulfstream G650 sliced through the violent winter storm, ascending above the heavy Colorado clouds into the dead of night. Inside the heavily pressurized cabin, the opulent atmosphere was a stark contrast to the brutal reality of what had just transpired in the frozen alleyway. Dante sat in a plush leather armchair, his jaw set like carved granite, his dark eyes fixed unblinking on the bed in the rear of the cabin. Julian lay there, sedated and wrapped in heated cashmere blankets. Dr. Sullivan, the syndicate's most trusted trauma surgeon, a man who had extracted bullets from Dante's own ribs without asking a single question, was carefully applying a soothing burn salve to the grotesque serpentine brand. The heavy scent of antiseptic mingled uncomfortably with the faint lingering metallic tang of blood in the pressurized air. The tissue damage is extensive, Dr. Sullivan murmured, his hands moving with precise, sterile efficiency. He did not look up, knowing better than to meet the boss's eyes when the devil was pacing behind them. The iron was held against his skin for far too long. It will scar permanently. I can recommend a plastic surgeon in Geneva once he heals. Perhaps a skin graft. No. Dante's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the terrifying weight of an executioner's gavel. We do not erase it. The scar remains. It is a testament to his survival, and a reminder of my failure. Dr. Sullivan nodded once, packing away his medical instruments into a black leather bag. He needs rest. The psychological trauma is just as deep as the physical burn. When you land at Logan, keep him isolated. Dante didn't need to be told. The moment the jet's wheels kissed the tarmac in Boston, Julian was quietly transferred into a heavily armored SUV and driven directly to Dante's fortress, a sprawling triplex penthouse at the top of the St. Regis Boston. The building was a modern marvel of glass and steel, heavily fortified with an elevator that required dual biometric scans to access his floor. Once inside, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the icy expanse of Boston Harbor, Dante finally allowed himself to breathe. He sat by his bedside until the first gray rays of dawn pierced the skyline, holding Julian's fragile hand against his cheek. But the morning light did not bring peace. It brought the hour of reckoning. Leaving Julian under the guard of his two most lethal enforcers, Dominic and Matteo, Dante descended into the city. He did not go to his corporate boardroom. He went to a desolate, soundproofed meatpacking warehouse in the Seaport District, a relic from the old days of the Boston mob, used only when blood was meant to be spilled off the books. Richard Ashford, Julian's father, arrived at the warehouse at exactly 9 in the morning, escorted by 4 of Dante's men. Richard was a slender, balding beta who wore expensive Italian suits that always looked a size too big for his cowardly frame. He walked into the freezing warehouse rubbing his hands together, his eyes darting nervously toward the meat hooks hanging from the rusted steel tracks above. "Dante, my boy," Richard forced a trembling smile, stepping into the dim light of a single swinging bulb. "Your men said you had news. Tell me you found that ungrateful boy. Tell me you found Julian. I swear to you, when he is brought back, I will discipline him myself for disrespecting our family." Dante stood in the shadows smoking a thick Cuban cigar. The cherry glowed violently in the darkness, the only indicator of the pure, unfiltered rage boiling beneath his tailored black suit. He stepped forward slowly, the heavy thud of his shoes echoing off the concrete floor. "You would discipline him, Richard?" Dante asked, his voice smooth as silk, yet laced with venom. He took a slow drag of his cigar. "A father's love. It is a beautiful thing to witness. A man should always protect his son." Richard swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature of the warehouse. "I raised him better, Dante. I don't know what possessed him to run on the eve of the wedding. It broke my heart." "Did it?" Dante closed the distance between them. He reached out, his hand moving so fast that Richard flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, Dante gently straightened the lapel of Richard's expensive coat. "I had a very interesting conversation with my Omega last night, Richard, in a blizzard in Colorado." The color completely drained from Richard's face. His knees buckled slightly, his breathing turning into shallow, panicked gasps. "You found him?" "Dante, whatever he told you, he's confused. The boy is hysterical. He told me about the blueprints to St. Michael's Cathedral. Dante interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, echoing like thunder. He told me about the explosive charges hidden near the organ. And he told me about the brand. Richard fell to his knees. The facade shattered instantly. Dante, please. Enzo Valentino had me by the throat. I owed him $2 million from the underground casinos in Macau. He threatened to kill me. I had to give him the security codes to the estate. I had no choice. A man always has a choice, Dante whispered, crouching down to look Richard directly in his weeping eyes. You could have come to me. I would have paid your debts. But you didn't just sell the codes, did you, Richard? My men intercepted Enzo's financial ledgers this morning. You didn't just wipe your debt. You accepted a 10% stake in the Boston logistics routes. You sold my life. And you let a butcher burn your own son's flesh for a promotion. I thought he was just going to scare him. Richard sobbed, grasping desperately at Dante's pant leg. I didn't know he brought an iron. I swear to God. Dante stood up, his face devoid of all human emotion. He looked down at the pathetic creature sobbing at his feet, the beta who had handed his innocent Omega over to a monster. God cannot hear you in this room, Richard, Dante said coldly. He turned his back and began to walk toward the heavy steel exit doors. Matteo. From the shadows, the towering enforcer stepped forward, unholstering a suppressed Glock 19. Don't shoot him, Dante commanded without looking back. A bullet is far too quick for a traitor who burns his own blood. Hang him from the chains. Let the cold take him, just like he froze in the snow. The agonizing screams of Richard Ashford echoed through the warehouse, but Dante was already gone. He had cleansed his own house. Now, it was time to burn down Enzo Valentino's empire. New York City was entirely unaware that a ghost had crossed its borders. 3 days after the execution in the Boston warehouse, Dante Marchetti sat in the back of a blacked-out armored Cadillac Escalade, parked silently on a wooded bluff overlooking a sprawling, heavily fortified compound in the Hamptons. Enzo Valentino's fortress. The Atlantic Ocean crashed violently against the cliffs below, mirroring the storm of vengeance brewing in Dante's heart. He hadn't come with an army. An army was loud. An army meant negotiations and sit-downs with the 5 families. Dante wasn't here to negotiate territory. He was here to carve a pound of flesh. He had brought only his 10 most lethal operators, men who moved like phantoms, dressed in tactical black, armed with suppressed weaponry and custom-forged combat knives. Security grid is down, boss, Dominic crackled over the secure earpiece. The localized EMF wiped their cameras and the perimeter alarms. We have a 4-minute window before their backup generators kick in. Execute, Dante commanded coldly. He racked the slide of his own weapon and stepped out into the freezing coastal wind. They descended upon the Valentino compound like a biblical plague. The outer guards were neutralized before they could even draw a breath, dragged silently into the manicured hedges. Dante didn't blink as he stepped over the bodies. His mind was laser-focused on one singular image, the grotesque serpentine brand burned into Julian's pale skin. They breached the main doors of the mansion. Inside, Enzo Valentino was hosting a high-stakes poker game in a lavish parlor adorned with baccarat crystal chandeliers and priceless Persian rugs. The heavy mahogany doors burst open, splintering off their hinges before Enzo's bodyguards could even reach for their holsters. A synchronized symphony of suppressed gunfire erupted. Twip, twip, twip. The sound was quiet, deadly, and absolute. Within 3 seconds, 6 of Enzo's top lieutenants collapsed onto the velvet furniture, their blood staining the antique carpets a deep, horrifying crimson. Only Enzo remained untouched, frozen in his leather armchair, a cigar dropping from his trembling lips. Dante stepped into the room, the smoke from his gun barrel drifting lazily toward the crystal chandelier. He looked like the Grim Reaper, wrapped in a bespoke Armani suit. Dante, Enzo stammered, raising his hands. His arrogant bravado vanished in the face of certain death. Wait. We can talk about this. The commission will have your head for coming into my territory. We can make a deal. I'll give you the ports in Jersey. All of them. Dante casually walked over to the grand fireplace crackling behind Enzo's chair. He didn't speak. He picked up a heavy wrought iron fire poker that was resting directly in the roaring flames. The tip of the iron was glowing a brilliant, white-hot orange. Enzo's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as he recognized the poetic justice about to unfold. He tried to scramble out of his chair, but Dominic and Matteo were instantly there, slamming his shoulders down, pinning the squirming New York boss forcefully into the leather cushions. You brought a blowtorch and an iron to a church, Enzo, Dante said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he stepped toward the captive alpha. He raised the glowing iron, feeling the intense heat radiating against his own cheek. You laid your hands on my Omega. You marked what is mine. Dante, please. It was business. It was just business. Enzo screamed, thrashing wildly against the unyielding grip of the enforcers. To you, it was business. Dante whispered, leaning in so close that Enzo could see the absolute lack of mercy in his pitch-black eyes. To me, it was a declaration of war, and a Marchetti never leaves a debt unpaid. Dante didn't hesitate. He drove the glowing iron poker squarely into the center of Enzo Valentino's chest. The agonizing, guttural scream that ripped from Enzo's throat shook the very foundation of the mansion. The sickening smell of burning flesh and scorching silk filled the lavish parlor. Dante held it there, his face completely impassive, watching the life drain from his greatest enemy's eyes until Enzo finally slumped forward, dead. Dante dropped the cooling iron onto the bloody rug. He adjusted his cuffs, turned his back on the carnage, and walked out into the ocean breeze. The debt was settled. The ghosts were put to rest. Dante didn't go straight back to the penthouse. He couldn't. Not yet. Not with the scent of burnt flesh still clinging to his clothes, the phantom screams of Enzo Valentino still echoing in his ears. He drove instead to a small, nondescript safe house in the North End, a place he used when he needed to disappear. He stripped off his blood-stained suit and stood under the scalding spray of the shower for what felt like an hour, watching the water run pink down the drain. But the water couldn't wash away the image of Julian's face when he had told him what Enzo had done. The hollow eyes, the trembling voice, the way he had flinched away from Dante's touch, expecting violence instead of comfort. He had failed him. Dante Marchetti, the devil of Boston, had failed the only Omega he had ever loved. He dressed in fresh clothes and finally drove back to the St. Regis. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like an eternity. When the doors slid open, he was greeted by silence. Dominic stood near the entrance, his face grim. He's been asking for you, boss. Hasn't slept. Won't eat. Dante nodded once and walked toward the master bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, and his heart cracked in his chest. Julian was sitting up in the massive bed, his knees drawn to his chest, the cashmere blanket pulled around his waist. He was staring out the window at the gray winter sky, his thin fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. He looked so small, so fragile, so utterly broken. He looked up when Dante entered, and something flickered in his eyes, relief, fear, hope, all tangled together. Dante, Julian whispered. You came back. Of course I came back. Dante crossed the room in 3 strides and sank onto the edge of the bed. I will always come back to you, Julian. Always. Julian's lower lip trembled. They told me you went to New York. To the Hamptons. They told me you. He couldn't finish the sentence. The tears started again, silent and steady, streaming down his pale cheeks. Dante reached out and cupped his face, his thumb brushing away the tears. It's done, amore mio. Enzo is gone. He will never touch you again. No one will ever touch you again. I thought you would hate me, Julian sobbed, leaning into Dante's touch like a man dying of thirst. When you found me, I thought you would hate me. I thought you would think I betrayed you. I thought you had betrayed me, Dante admitted, his voice rough with self-loathing. I was angry. I was blinded by my own pride. I didn't see the truth. I didn't see what he had done to you. I am so sorry, Julian. I am so sorry I wasn't there to protect you. Julian shook his head frantically. No, it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known. They were so careful, Dante. They planned everything. There was nothing you could have done. I should have known. Dante's voice broke. I should have felt it. I should have sensed something was wrong. You are my omega. My bonded. The bond should have told me you were in danger, and I was too consumed by my own anger to feel it. You did feel it, Julian whispered, his hand coming up to cover Dante's on his cheek. You hunted me across the country. You never stopped looking. You tore through the world to find me. I would tear through 1,000 worlds to find you, Dante said fiercely, pulling Julian into his arms. Don't you ever doubt that, Julian. You are my life, my heart, my everything. Julian buried his face in the crook of Dante's neck, his body shaking with sobs. Dante held him close, one hand cradling the back of his head, the other wrapped around his waist, pulling him as close as physically possible. He breathed in Julian's scent, the vanilla and honey that had always calmed him, now tinged with something darker, the lingering tang of fear and trauma. I was so scared, Julian confessed against his skin. When they took me, I was so scared. I thought I was going to die, Dante. I thought I would never see you again. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was knowing you would think I had abandoned you, that you would hate me, that I would die knowing you hated me. Dante's arms tightened around him. I could never hate you, Julian. Not then. Not now. Not ever. You are the only good thing in my life. You are the only reason I have any humanity left. Do you understand me? Julian pulled back slightly, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen. Then why did you chase me like I was a criminal? Why did you track me like I was something to be captured? Dante closed his eyes. The question was fair. The question was deserved. Because I was terrified, he admitted. I was terrified that you had left me willingly, that you had decided I wasn't enough, that you had seen the monster inside me and run from it. And the thought of losing you, the thought of you choosing to leave, it made me crazy, Julian. It made me into something worse than a monster. It made me into a fool. Julian's lips parted in surprise. You were scared? You, Dante Marchetti? The devil of Boston? Terrified, Dante repeated, his voice barely a whisper. I would rather face 100 men with guns than face the reality that you didn't love me anymore. I never stopped loving you, Julian said fiercely. Not for 1 second. Not even when the iron was searing my skin. Not even when I was running through the snow, thinking I would freeze to death. I loved you. I always loved you. I love you. Dante pulled him into another kiss, this one deeper, hungrier, more desperate. He poured everything into it, every moment of fear, every minute of regret, every ounce of love he had been too proud to admit. Julian responded in kind, his hands fisting in Dante's shirt, pulling him closer, refusing to let go. They broke apart only when they needed air, foreheads resting together, breathing each other's breath. I'm never letting you go again, Dante vowed. I don't care what happens. I don't care who stands in my way. You are mine, Julian. And I am yours. Bonded. Forever. Forever, Julian echoed. And for the first time in weeks, there was a genuine smile on his face. The days that followed were a slow, painful process of healing. Julian remained fragile, his body still recovering from the trauma, his mind still haunted by the memories of what Enzo Valentino had done to him. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, thrashing against the sheets, convinced he was still tied to that chair in the maintenance shed, the smell of his own burning flesh filling his nostrils. And every time, Dante was there. He would pull Julian into his arms, murmuring soft reassurances in Italian, pressing gentle kisses to his forehead until the trembling subsided and Julian could breathe again. Dante refused to leave him alone for more than a few hours at a time. He conducted business from the penthouse, his lieutenants coming to him rather than the other way around. He personally vetted every single person who came within 50 feet of Julian, and he made it abundantly clear that anyone who so much as looked at his Omega the wrong way would answer to him personally. Dominic and Matteo stood guard at all hours, their loyalty absolute, their vigilance unwavering. But even with all the protection in the world, Julian couldn't escape the darkness inside his own mind. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He spent hours staring out the window, his eyes vacant, his expression blank. The spark that had once defined him, the warmth and vibrancy that had made Dante fall in love with him in the first place, seemed to have been extinguished by Enzo's cruelty. And Dante didn't know how to bring it back. He tried everything. He brought Julian's favorite foods from the best restaurants in Boston. He hired the finest therapists, though Julian refused to speak to any of them. He bought him books, music, art supplies, anything that might spark a flicker of interest. Julian accepted all of it with a quiet, hollow gratitude that broke Dante's heart a little more each day. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after they had returned from Colorado, when Dante finally lost his patience. He had come back from a brief meeting with his capos to find Julian exactly where he had left him, curled up on the window seat, staring out at the gray expanse of Boston Harbor. The untouched tray of food Dante had left for him was still sitting on the nightstand, the coffee cold, the bread stale. "Julian," Dante said, his voice carefully controlled. "You need to eat." "I'm not hungry," Julian replied, not turning around. "You haven't been hungry for 3 weeks." Dante crossed the room and knelt in front of him, forcing Julian to meet his eyes. "You're wasting away, amore mio. I can see your bones. I can feel them when I hold you. Please, eat something. For me." Julian's eyes filled with tears. "I can't, Dante. I can't. Every time I try to swallow, I remember. I remember the taste of my own blood. I remember the sound of my father's voice, telling them where to put the iron. I remember." He broke off, his voice catching in his throat, and Dante pulled him into his arms. "Listen to me," Dante said fiercely. "Listen to me, Julian. What Enzo did to you is unspeakable. What your father did was unforgivable. But they are both dead now. They cannot hurt you anymore. The only person who can hurt you now is yourself. And I cannot stand by and watch you destroy yourself. I won't." Julian sobbed against his chest. "I don't know how to be normal again, Dante. I don't know how to be the person I was before. I feel broken. I feel like there's nothing left inside me." "There is," Dante said, tilting his chin up to meet his gaze. "There is so much left inside you, Julian. I see it. Every day. In the way you still smile when I bring you coffee. In the way you still reach for me in your sleep. In the way you still love me, even after everything that happened. You are not broken. You are scarred, yes. But scars are not weaknesses. They are proof that you survived." Julian stared at him, his eyes searching Dante's face for something, some sign that he was lying. But Dante held his gaze, unwavering, and slowly, Julian's expression softened. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I believe it with every fiber of my being," Dante said. "And I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you, if that's what it takes." Julian took a shaky breath and nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I'll try. I'll try to eat." Dante kissed his forehead, his eyes burning with unshed tears of his own. "That's all I ask." Over the next few weeks, Julian began to make progress. It was slow and painfully incremental, but it was progress nonetheless. He started eating small meals. He started sleeping through the night, though he still had nightmares. He started leaving the penthouse, first just to walk around the building's private garden, then to venture out into the city with Dante by his side. Dante was there for all of it. He held Julian's hand when they walked through crowded streets. He wrapped his arms around him when the nightmares came. He kissed the scar on Julian's shoulder every night before they went to sleep, a ritual that had become as essential as breathing. And little by little, Julian began to heal. The hollow look in his eyes began to fade. The smile that had once defined him began to return, tentative at first, then brighter and more genuine. He laughed again, a sound that made Dante's heart soar. He danced in the kitchen while Dante cooked dinner. He painted, filling canvas after canvas with vibrant colors that seemed to chase away the shadows. But the scar remained. Julian still refused to look at it. He wore high-collared shirts and kept his back to the mirror. He flinched when Dante's fingers brushed against the raised tissue, though he tried to hide it. Dante didn't push. He waited. He knew that Julian would come to terms with the scar in his own time, and he would be there when he did. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the first truly warm day of the year, when it finally happened. Julian was sitting on the balcony, wrapped in a silk robe, watching the boats glide across the harbor. He had been quiet all morning, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Dante joined him with 2 cups of coffee, setting one down in front of Julian before taking the seat beside him. "Julian," Dante said gently, "can I ask you something?" Julian nodded, not looking away from the view. "When are you going to let me see it?" Julian's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The scar, Julian." Dante reached out and placed his hand over Julian's, stilling his trembling fingers. "I know you've been hiding it from me. I know you turn away when I undress you. I know you flinch when I touch your shoulder." Julian's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want you to see it. It's ugly. It's disgusting. It's a part of you," Dante interrupted softly. "And I love every part of you. The scar doesn't change that. It never could. I need you to understand that." Julian shook his head. "You don't understand. It was meant to destroy you. Enzo branded me so that you would hate me, so that you would reject me, so that he could break us. And it worked, didn't it? For 2 weeks, you thought I had betrayed you. For 2 weeks, you hated me." "I never hated you," Dante corrected. "I was angry, yes. I was hurt. But I never hated you, Julian. I could never hate you. And Enzo is dead. His plans are dust. But you are still here, holding on to the pain he inflicted on you. And I can't bear to see you suffer." Julian's tears spilled over. "I'm so ashamed, Dante. I'm so ashamed that he did that to me. That I couldn't stop him. That I was so weak." "You were not weak," Dante said fiercely, turning Julian's face toward him. "You were the strongest person I have ever known. You took that brand to save my life. To save my family. You endured torture to protect me. That is not weakness, Julian. That is the greatest strength I have ever witnessed." Julian sobbed, covering his face with his hands. "I was so scared. I was so scared he would hurt you. I couldn't. Dante pulled him into his arms, cradling him against his chest. "I know, amore mio. I know. But I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. And I need you to trust me. I need you to let me see the scar. To let me kiss it. To let me replace the memory of his pain with my love." Julian trembled in his arms, but after a long moment, he nodded. Slowly, Dante pulled back. He reached for Julian's robe, his fingers grazing the soft silk. "May I?" Julian squeezed his eyes shut and nodded again. Dante gently pushed the robe off Julian's left shoulder. The fabric pooled around his elbow, exposing the skin beneath. And there it was, the scar. The serpent coiled around the dagger. The angry, puckered flesh that had once been smooth and flawless. Dante's breath caught in his throat. But he didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. Instead, he leaned in and pressed his lips to the scar in a soft, reverent kiss. Julian gasped, his eyes flying open. "Dante, I love you," Dante murmured against his skin. "Every part of you. This scar is proof of your strength, Julian. Proof of your sacrifice. Proof of how much you love me. And I will never, ever let anyone hurt you again." Julian stared at him, his eyes wide, filled with wonder. You really mean that? I mean it with every fiber of my being. Dante kissed the scar again, then lifted his head to meet Julian's gaze. You are my omega, my bonded, my partner, my everything. And I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much you are loved. Julian laughed, a wet, broken sound that was more tears than joy. I love you, Dante. I love you so much it scares me. It scares me too, Dante admitted with a small smile. But we'll face it together. Always. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Spring gave way to summer, and Boston bloomed with color and life. Julian's recovery continued apace. He started taking walks in the public gardens, often with Dante by his side, sometimes on his own. He started visiting with friends, carefully vetted by Dominic and Matteo, rebuilding the social connections that Enzo had tried to destroy. He started cooking again, filling the penthouse with the scent of garlic and basil and fresh bread. Dante watched him with a mixture of pride and love. The Omega he had first fallen in love with was coming back. The spark was returning to his eyes, the warmth to his smile. And Dante knew, with absolute certainty, that he would spend the rest of his life protecting that spark. One evening, as the sun set over the harbor, Julian turned to Dante with a look of quiet determination. I want to marry you, he said simply. Dante nearly choked on his wine. What? I want to marry you, Julian repeated. I know we were supposed to get married before all of this happened. I know I ran away. I know I left you standing at the altar. But I want to make it right. I want to marry you, Dante. For real this time. Dante set down his glass and took Julian's hands in his. Are you sure? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Are you absolutely sure, Julian? Because I need you to be sure. I need you to know that I will never leave you, that I will never hurt you, that I will spend every single day of my life loving you with everything I have. But I need you to be sure. Julian smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up his entire face. I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life, Dante. I love you, and I want to marry you. I want to stand in front of God and everyone we love and promise to be yours forever. And I want everyone to see that scar, he added, his voice faltering for just a moment. I want everyone to see what I survived, what we survived. And I want them to know that no one, not Enzo Valentino, not my father, not anyone, can ever break us. Dante pulled him into a kiss, deep and passionate and full of promise. Then we'll get married, he said against Julian's lips. We'll have the wedding we always dreamed of. Big or small, it doesn't matter to me. All that matters is that at the end of it, you're mine. And I'm yours. Julian laughed, tears streaming down his cheeks. I'm already yours, Dante. I've been yours since the moment I met you. In the days leading up to the wedding, Dante threw himself into the preparations with an intensity that surprised even his closest advisors. He wanted everything to be perfect, not for himself, but for Julian. He wanted to give his Omega the wedding he deserved, the wedding that had been stolen from them by Enzo Valentino's cruelty. The guest list was small and carefully curated. Only those who had proven their loyalty beyond any doubt were invited. Dominic and Matteo would serve as best men. Dr. Sullivan would officiate, having been ordained online for the occasion. There would be no rival capos, no political maneuvering, no hidden agendas. Just love, pure and simple and undeniable. Julian spent the week before the wedding in a state of nervous excitement. He flitted around the penthouse like a hummingbird, checking and rechecking every detail. He had chosen a simple ivory suit for the ceremony, elegant and understated, with a plunging back that would expose his scar. It was a deliberate choice, a statement of defiance and pride. He wanted the world to see what he had survived. He wanted them to know that Enzo Valentino had not broken him. Dante, for his part, was calm. He had faced down rival families, survived assassination attempts, and built an empire from nothing. A wedding was nothing compared to that. But when he saw Julian on the morning of the ceremony, standing in front of the mirror in that ivory suit, his scar on full display, his eyes bright with hope and joy, Dante felt his heart stop. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," Dante said, his voice thick with emotion. Julian turned to him, a soft smile on his lips. "I'm not beautiful. I'm scarred." "You are both," Dante said, crossing the room to stand behind him. He wrapped his arms around Julian's waist and pressed a kiss to the scar on his shoulder. "The scar is part of you, and you are beautiful. All of you. Every inch." Julian leaned back against him, his eyes closing. "I love you, Dante. I love you, and I can't wait to marry you." "Neither can I," Dante whispered against his skin. The ceremony was held in a small private chapel on the outskirts of the North Shore. The stones were weathered and gray, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Inside, the air was cool and fragrant with the scent of old wood and candle wax. The pews were nearly empty, filled only with the few people who mattered most. Dante stood at the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never been nervous before a business deal, never flinched in the face of danger. But now, waiting for Julian to walk down the aisle, he felt like a teenager on his first date. And then the doors opened, and Julian appeared. He walked slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on Dante's. His ivory suit gleamed in the candlelight, the plunging back exposing the scar that had once been the source of so much shame. But Julian held his head high, his shoulders back, his expression radiant with love and joy. He reached the altar, and Dante stepped forward to take his hands. "You came," Dante whispered, his voice cracking. "I told you I would," Julian replied. "I told you I would never run again." Dr. Sullivan cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His words were simple but heartfelt, speaking of love and loyalty and the unbreakable bond between two souls. He spoke of the trials they had faced, the pain they had endured, and the strength they had found in each other. And then it was time for the vows. Dante went first. He took Julian's hands in his and looked into his eyes, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "Julian," he said, "from the moment I met you, I knew you were different. I knew you were special. I knew you were the one I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. And I was right. You have shown me more strength, more courage, more love than I ever thought possible. You have taught me what it means to be vulnerable, what it means to trust, what it means to love unconditionally. And I promise you, on my life and on my honor, that I will never let anyone hurt you again. I will protect you. I will cherish you. I will love you with every breath in my body until the day I die." Julian's eyes were shining with tears. He squeezed Dante's hands and took a shaky breath. "Dante," he said, "you are the most terrifying man I have ever met, and also the most wonderful. When I first saw you, I was afraid of you. You were so powerful, so intense, so overwhelming. But then I got to know you. I saw the man behind the monster, and I fell in love, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. Because you are fierce and loyal and protective. Because you would burn the world down for the people you love. And because, in my darkest moment, when I thought I had lost everything, you found me. You brought me back. You gave me hope. And you showed me that love is stronger than fear. That love is stronger than hate. That love is stronger than anything. And I promise you, Dante, I will love you for the rest of my life. I will stand by your side. I will support you. I will challenge you. I will be your partner, your confidant, your mate. Forever." The priest spoke the final words, and Dante and Julian exchanged rings. Simple platinum bands that caught the candlelight and gleamed like stars. And then, finally, Dr. Sullivan said the words they had been waiting for. "I now pronounce you mated for life. You may kiss." Dante pulled Julian into his arms and kissed him with all the passion and love he possessed. The kiss was deep and tender and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, The small congregation erupted into applause. Julian laughed, tears streaming down his cheeks. "We did it," he said. "We actually did it." "We did," Dante replied, pressing his forehead against Julian's. "And I have never been happier in my entire life." The reception was held back at the penthouse. Dominic had outdone himself, preparing a feast that would have rivaled any five-star restaurant. There was champagne, of course, and a magnificent cake that Dr. Sullivan had commissioned from a bakery in the North End. They ate and drank and laughed, the joy of the occasion washing away the shadows of the past. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the penthouse was quiet, Dante and Julian stood on the balcony, looking out at the glittering lights of Boston. Dante wrapped his arms around Julian from behind, his chin resting on his shoulder, his lips brushing against the scar on his neck. "Are you happy, amore mio?" Dante asked softly. Julian turned in his arms, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said. "I have you. I have a future. I have a life that is my own. What more could I possibly want?" Dante kissed him, slow and tender. "I love you, Julian, more than I thought I was capable of loving anything. And I promise you, I will spend every day of our lives proving that to you. I will protect you. I will cherish you. I will never, ever let anyone hurt you again." Julian smiled, resting his head against Dante's chest. "I know, Dante. I know." And in that moment, standing on the balcony with the love of his life in his arms, Dante Marchetti felt something he had never felt before. Peace. He had spent his entire life fighting, killing, clawing his way to the top. He had built an empire out of blood and violence. But nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the simple, profound joy of holding his mate in his arms and knowing that they had survived. The scar on Julian's shoulder was a reminder of everything they had lost, but it was also a reminder of everything they had gained. It was a testament to Julian's strength, his sacrifice, his unwavering love. And Dante would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life. They had walked through the fire together, and they had come out the other side, stronger, closer, more in love than ever before. The devil had met his match, and together they would rule the world.